My name's Eddie Weller, and I have the briefest part of the program today. What I'm supposed to do is just set the mood for you. We're in Houston. The only thing you'll recognize today from the tradition of back then is the humidity. That never changes. It is always here. So if we had a little time machine, or as my son would say, if we had a TARDIS, we could go back to 1860, and we'd find a far different city. One of the things you would notice immediately is the difference in size. It's almost impossible for us today to realize how much smaller Houston is. When I say that it's the third largest city in Texas in 1860, that may be inappropriate because I'm not sure we had a city in Texas in 1860. On there, as you can see in 1860, and I put, if you can read those, I hope you can at a distance, to see its growth. It doubles nearly 1850 to 60, and even during the Civil War, it'll nearly double. But in 1860, less than 5,000 people. Galveston at over 7,000, and San Antonio over at 8,000. And as I point out, Dallas was still only 2,000. They can't help it. They've always tried to reach up to Houston and couldn't make it. Or as we always say in history, if it ends in triple zeros, they lied. They counted a few dead dogs and others along the way. Maybe it's better to put that, though, in perspective of the cities in the United States. Manhattan, or New York City, that's all it was at that time, was over 800,000. Texas did not have a city in the top 100. Just to give an example, Wilmington, North Carolina was the 100th largest city at just under 10,000. So Texas, while a frontier and going to grow to great things, in 1860, it was, in fact, very small. But then when we look at it, what was the daily life like? I always like to point out at that time there were far more saloons than churches on there, and some of my friends are aghast at that, and others smile and get that snicker and say, can we go back at that time? Perhaps one of the most famous saloon keepers was the Irish immigrant Dick Dowling, famous later, as we'll hear, at the Battle of Sabine Pass. He had the Bank of Bacchus on there, a very popular bar, although during the war, most of the bars actually will shut down, and in fact, churches might for a short time outnumber saloons. And part of that because the young men are gone, and part of that because during the war, whiskey prices go from 25 cents a gallon to between $20 and $23 a gallon on there. You talk about having gold to base your economy on. We now know that in fact, Houston's could have been based on whiskey. Another interesting part where there were, as they used to say, many fallen angels or soiled doves. And as some would say, there were probably more bordellos, although not listed, than there were churches as well. Churches had begun, synagogues had begun. The first church of record is the Methodist Church in 1837, so starting early. Episcopalians start in the 1830s, Presbyterians in 1841, Catholics get the first church, 1842. Baptists are a little slower to get their building because there was a common building and they were cheap. The first Baptist building doesn't come till 1847, and it was several women who got together to raise money, and the men made merciless fun of them until they raised enough money to build the building, and then they were embarrassed. And the first synagogue was in 1854. When you ask people then, I guess, today, the two things that are most obvious would have been mosquitoes. Those are just always with us. But the other aspect of Houston was mud. There was mud everywhere. You couldn't get away from it no matter how hard you tried. One of my favorite stories is about the man who walks up and sees this nice hat out in the middle of the street. He goes over to pick it up, and when he does, a head looks up at him and says, "Excuse me, sir, would you please put that back down? The sun is a bit hot without it." And the man looks down and says, "My, you seem to be in quite a precarious position there," because all he has is his head above the mud. And he says, "Well, it's not good for me, but the team of horses I'm on are really having a tough time of it." Mud was everywhere. In fact, people made money carrying people across the streets. They had little boards that go across, and I'm sure no boys would have ever done this, and if I'd been living there, I would have probably had a rawhide from it, but they would, slip and knock people off as they walked by. So mud was something you lived with all of the time. When we think of Houston, too, I always get a kick. Some things never change. One of those is one of the big problems that they had, and a city ordinance was passed to rectify this in the early 1860s. No person shall drive or cause to be driven or ride over any bridge faster than a walk. We've always had trouble with speed demons in Houston at that time, 150 years ago. Another major problem they had was trying to enforce the law that there would, quote, be no liquor sales on the Sabbath. They failed regularly, especially because some of the police enjoyed getting it themselves. The one that is arguably less pleasant is that there was also a law in 1860 that all white males over the age of 18 were required to join a slave patrol or be fined $3. So Houston has an interesting 1860 time frame. We talk about transportation. Buffalo Bayou, Houston was first and foremost a river town. In fact, the first steamboat is going to come in 1837, the Laura, to the area. Cotton bales will be its greatest exports. By 1860, over 50,000 bales. Goods were also often shipped into Texas from New Orleans, some to Galveston, but some straight into Houston. Cut off a little bit of that extra travel. The Houston Direct Navigation Company is going to come into being during the 1860s, and by the end of the decade, we'll be carrying over 11,000 passengers and over 815,000 barrels of materials. Houston, though, by 1860 was also becoming a major railroad town. What you see is that lines already stretched anywhere from 50 to 100 miles south, southeast, east, northwest, and west of Houston. And in fact, when it finally catches in up in Denison, Houston will be connected to the National Railroad line. So transportation has always been important and forward-looking. Commerce and industry was already started here. Arguably the first was a sawmill and a grist mill on Buffalo Bayou that in fact probably predates the Republic, from what they can tell. First cotton compress was in 1844. The first foundry in 1851. By the way, no one says when the first still is. They can't figure that one out. Market Hall, the original one, is where today you see the appeals court building, originally between Preston and Congress. It was at a one block long building that actually was 2 stories at one end. They called it the jail was on the bottom level, and on the top was City Hall, and they called the jail the caboose as such on there. But what was most interesting to people, which shows again some of the wild character of Houston, was that the 2 brothers Rousseau ran the earliest market there, and what they were famous for were 2 things. They had a beautiful daughter who may have been the prettiest girl in all of Houston, and a parrot that could swear in French. And that was impressive to them. We already have bridges across Buffalo Bayou. They built the Long Bridge after the flood of 1853 from the top of a bank to the top of the bank of the other side to make sure it wouldn't fail in a flood. But unfortunately, in the early 1870s, it'll be washed away too. So Houston is far different. No paved roads, instead just mud pits coming in. A lot more saloons and liquor stores than you could imagine even today. And yet, it is the beginnings of what will become the 4th largest city in America and what we all call home. So today, as we explore what Houston is like in the 1860s, live back in that time and enjoy it. Thank you very much.